in Bangkok. First, I thought he's in Singapore, which would make it 1 o'clock in the morning. So, I mean, I really admire you. I don't think I would be able to do such an event at that time.
It's a 724 world.
Yeah, this is true. You are used to it. But of course, the United States are, for you, are more easier. I mean, with the time difference, no? So
Actually,
Europe,
it depends.
yeah,
Actually, it depends because the West Coast is 15 hours apart from here.
yeah, yeah, it's true. Yeah. So let me introduce James Dorsey to those who do not know him. He's a senior fellow at the, I hope I say it correctly, Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University. And he's a columnist, and I mean, a really big recommendation. He's the author of a book and also a very famous blog, which is Please Listen to Me, if you don't know, The Turbulent World of Middle East Soccer. So, I mean, especially also in Qatar times of football, what is it, World Championship, I think mostly interesting. But as, I mean, journalist and scholar, he focuses on geopolitics of Eurasia. And I mean, he deals with the Middle East and North Africa for, I don't know, a whole life. I mean, you did also other things, but really a long time. I mean, you have to imagine there is a long journalistic career. He knows the Middle East from personal experience. I think you reported from Jerusalem, Cairo, Tehran, Beirut, Kuwait. You witnessed, I mean, all from the Lebanese civil war to the Iranian Revolution, you were there. And for many different media, like the Christian Science Monitor, Wall Street Journal, United Press International. And James told us, and some of you who deal with Austrian Zeitgeschichte also might know, that he used to meet Bruno Kreisky, no? And not only once, but on one point monthly and over several years. And he met him also in Mallorca, if I understood correctly. And therefore, we are, of course, especially happy and to welcome him here finally. I mean, finally to the Bruno Kreisky Forum, which is it's high time. And in my series, in my Middle East, North Africa series. Our topic, I mean, I will not talk long. It's US policies in the Middle East and the question, what's working better, no? Or for a longer time also, no? What we would call value-based foreign policies, which means adhering to principles, to human rights principles in the relationship with countries and their leaderships, or betting on autocratic rule to provide stability and security in those countries or in the region. I think and this is happening most of the time, I would say. There are so many practical examples to address this issue. When we agreed the topic, we did not know that it would fall into a time of once again deteriorating relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. As you well know, President Joe Biden went to Saudi Arabia. He seemed to try to mend ties when he went to Jeddah in July and met Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, which was really looking like realpolitik in times of war, of course, the Ukraine war. But obviously now the United States, nevertheless, is not willing to easily support the MBS claim of immunity, which comes with his new job as Saudi Prime Minister. And of course, we are talking about the Khashoggi case. I think this is very clear. So what is it? I mean, trying to have the cake and eat it. And of course, it had consequences, as you well know, or not. I mean, Saudi Arabia says it has nothing to do with the decisions in OPEC about reducing oil production. But I will stop here and I will let James talk. I'm again welcoming him and looking forward to listening to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene, for that really
Gudrun,
generous, but
Gudrun.
also very,
Marlene is the boss behind
oh,
our talk.
my
I am Gudrun.
apologies, my apologies. But
No
thank you for that
problem.
very generous, but also very helpful introduction. It is indeed a particular pleasure to speak at the Bruno Kreisky Forum, given that I had met Bruno Kreisky numerous times and the fact that he twice was a witness for my defense in libel cases in Austria that I had. But let me move on today to today's theme, in which I would argue that at the core of a US policy debate over the Middle East lies the question of how best to ensure regional stability and protect United States interests. That question has been thrown into sharp relief as US relations between Saudi Arabia and to a lesser extent the United Arab Emirates have deteriorated in ways not seen since the 1973 Arab oil boycott. Leaving aside the grievances on both sides of the divide, which we can delve into the discussion, how the disputes are resolved is likely to shape the United States' vision of how to guarantee regional security going forward. Several interrelated factors frame the US debate and the tension in relations with two of the 6 Gulf states. One, the transition from a unipolar to either a bi or multipolar 21st century world order. The legitimate questions about what a rejiggered US commitment to Middle East security is, the tension between US values and the demands of realpolitik, and the emergence of a new generation of Middle Eastern leaders with a focus on Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and United Arab Emirates President Mohammed bin Zayed. What further binds these factors is the poor handling by successive US administrations of the fallout in the Middle East of a changing global environment with the rise of China and the rise and possible fall of Russia, and the response of various administrations to change in the Middle East as a result of the 9/11 attacks, the war on terror, and the 2011 popular Arab revolts. To some extent, change in the Middle East is in line with global developments, including in the United States, such as the increased strength of nationalism, the reemergence of populism, and the perceived need of Middle Eastern nations to hedge bets by diversifying foreign relations. In March, Abdul Khalik Abdullah, a political scientist who often reflects thinking in official Emirati circles, said the UAE's abstention in a United Nations Security Council vote on Ukraine was, quote, consistent with the new UAE foreign policy activism, which stems from being confident of its decisions and its approach to global and regional politics. Mr. Abdullah went on to say that finally, we are independent enough, competent enough to take this kind of a position, which is consistent with our own way of doing things. Maybe it doesn't resonate too well in Washington, but that's the way things are going to be from now on. Time will tell. It wouldn't be the first time that the UAE has made risky geopolitical bets that have backfired, such as its interventions in Yemen alongside Saudi Arabia and in Libya. The interventions were part of a broader regional effort to roll back the achievements of the 2011 Arab revolts that toppled 4 autocrats and to counter Islamists. Tellingly, the UAE and Saudi Arabia voted earlier this month in favor of a UN General Assembly vote condemning Russia's annexation of parts of Ukraine. In addition, Saudi Arabia pledged $400 million in humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Indeed, in a twist of irony, the Ukraine crisis could force Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to rethink their newly found position. The crisis is likely to demonstrate that they can only hedge so much to compensate for perceived lessening of the United States' commitment to their security and because of their significant economic ties to China. Moreover, in a double whammy, the Ukraine crisis potentially could spark tough security and alliance choices and another round of popular protest in what would be the second decade of defiance and dissent, sparked in part by grain shortages and rising food prices. Even if protest in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, two of the region's wealthiest countries, is unlikely, Middle Eastern autocrats could well discover that the Ukrainians putting their lives on the line to stop the Russians, Middle Easterners can only be intimidated that much. Recent protests in Iraq, Iran, Jordan, and Tunisia, and the fact that the 2010s were bookended by protest and the toppling of leaders in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and Yemen in 2011, and Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, and Sudan in 2019 and 2020, which illustrates the point. Drought and reduced agricultural output that persuaded people to move from the countryside into cities is believed to be part of the fuel that drove anti-government protests in Syria in 2011, which sucked the country into a decade-long devastating and bloody war. Rising grain prices provoked riots in Egypt as far back as 1977. Egyptian bread prices have soared in recent months, forcing the government to fix the price. In contrast to the United States, the UAE and Russia may see eye to eye on their perceived need to prevent or roll back popular uprisings like the Arab revolts or colored revolutions in Ukraine and elsewhere in the former communist world. Yet, that will not do much for the UAE's regional security needs if the Gulf state and the United States increasingly go different ways. All of this does not mean that the crisis in confidence between the United States and Saudi Arabia and the UAE can be easily resolved. The US has mishandled global and regional changes for far too long. The mishandling includes the Bush administration's war on terror, with its witting or unwitting demonization of Islam and Muslims, the handling of the war in Afghanistan rather than the 2001 intervention itself, and the war in Iraq. Add to that Barack Obama's failure to consult the Gulf states and Israel on the initiation of nuclear talks with Iran that produced the 2015 nuclear agreement, and his refusal to adhere to his red line in Syria, involving the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons. Donald Trump's failure to step up to the plate in response to Iranian or Iranian-backed attacks on vital infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And Joe Biden's backtracking in his initial confrontational approach to Saudi Arabia because of Mr. bin Salman's hubris and human rights abuse, first and foremost, the 2018 killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Compounding all of this was a US failure to clearly define the parameters of US security guarantees as the policy focus pivoted to Russia and China, and an evolved incorrect reading of the Carter Doctrine as a US guarantee to ensure the survival of Middle Eastern autocracy rather than defense of the region and its crucial waterways against attack by an external power, presumed to be a threat posed by the Soviet Union. Lost in the debate is whether the cost of maintaining stability by supporting autocratic rule is lower in the long term than the upfront expense of adhering to human rights principles, pluralism, and transparent and accountable governance that would initially alienate Middle Eastern partners. The United States has long operated on the principle of kicking the can down the road by supporting autocracy at the expense of making greater transparency and accountability cornerstones of cooperation with Washington. The short-term benefits are obvious, but so are the wounds that fester because they are not properly treated, causing a greater turmoil and costing more to resolve further down the road. Moreover, the approach that juxtaposes US actions against US rhetoric makes US pledges of adherence to values ring hollow at a time when credibility may be a major determining factor in the rivalry with Russia and China. For the United States, the cost of making transparent and accountable governance a cornerstone of cooperation may quickly prove less costly when dealing with Gulf states, who in the short and middle term have few options. Neither China nor Russia is willing or able to replace the United States as the region's security guarantor, even if the United States is seeking to rejigger its commitment to free up energy and resources for its rivalry with China. A study by political scientists and international affairs scholars Andrew Stravers and Donald Coord argues that despite paying lip service to democratic values, the US commitment to autocratic rule in the Gulf is as much a function of US military strategy as it is of the Middle East strategic geography that straddles some of the world's most important maritime choke points. Mr. Stravers and Mrs. Elcourt argued that, quote, American forces have an autocratizing effect on host nations in strategically valuable regions. Americans and host interests align in supporting regime survival, where the location is critical to the United States and its global system of trade and military preeminence. The alignment produces increasing autocracy rather than simple regime stability, unquote. The authors suggested that an American military presence can increase autocracy in strategic regions where American planners are uncertain of the national military's ability to withstand regime change. Mr. Stravers and Mrs. Elcourt went on to reason that the US military presence produces a need for the host regime to suppress opposition in order to maintain perceived stability and entrench its domestic position. This increases the level of authoritarianism over time. This phenomenon is particularly true for the Gulf, where the loss of a military base would have far more far-reaching consequences for the US global position than the need to close or move a facility in, for example, Japan. The author's emphasis on the significance of strategic geography in support of autocracy or democratization is borne out in a comparison of US policy regarding the 2011 popular uprising in Bahrain, home to the US Fifth Fleet, and protests 6 years earlier in Uzbekistan, where the US had a significant military presence at the height of the Afghan War. The US stood aside when Saudi-led Gulf troops squashed the revolt in Bahrain. In Uzbekistan, Washington had no problem losing its military facilities after taking the government to task for repressing protests and violating human rights. Mr. Stravers and Mrs. Elcourt concluded that an American military presence has an autocratizing effect in particular regions of strategic importance. In areas of less strategic importance, American presence has relatively little effect on regimes. Regional alliances, particularly with Israel, may compensate to a degree for Gulf uncertainty about US reliability, but are fraught with pitfalls. Gulf states are a long way from being able to shoulder full responsibility for their defense, which in the case of the smaller states may never be achievable, even if there is greater emphasis on building domestic arms industries. The balance between values, morals, and ethics will be put next month to a very public litmus test, when the Biden administration has to decide whether to grant the Saudi Crown Prince, and since recently Prime Minister, Mr. bin Salman, sovereign immunity in a case related to the killing of Khashoggi, presided by Judge John Bates. The journalist's fiance and a nonprofit organization he helped found filed the lawsuit in a Washington district court. Mr. bin Salman's recent appointment was designed to counter the legal arguments that he would not qualify for sovereign immunity because he was neither a head of state, head of government, or foreign minister. Fact remains that he was neither at the time of Khashoggi's death. The current crisis in US-Saudi relations has politicized the administration's options even more. Mr. Biden has vowed that the Saudi push for reduced OPEC plus oil production would have serious consequences. That statement, amid mounting hostility towards Saudi Arabia across the aisle in Congress because of Mr. bin Salman's perceived undermining of the president and US interests, is likely to be put to the test by whatever the administration decides. The tension between infusing values, morals, and ethics into politics and policy and tackling double standards in applying the law come together in Judge Bates' court case and Mr. Biden's effort to defend democracy at home and abroad. The ability to do so depends on the US administration and civil society. One approach may be that the administration lays out a roadmap that tackles the legitimate charge that US policy is hypocritical by establishing criteria for maintaining morals and ethics in domestic and foreign policy to justify instances where that is not immediately possible. Civil society would have to hold the administration and business's feet to the fire. That is equally true with regard to the US security commitment in the Middle East, something successive administrations have allowed the world to speculate about rather than spelling it out in clear and unambiguous terms. It left America's Middle Eastern partners in a bind, having to fend for themselves as they tried to make sense of a series of policy fiascos. In terms of values, a draft of the Pentagon's 1992 defense planning guidance seemed to take a stab at crafting a roadmap. The draft stipulated that while the US cannot become the world's policeman by assuming responsibility for righting every wrong, we will retain preeminent responsibility for addressing selectively those wrongs which threaten not only our interests, but those of our allies or friends, or which could seriously unsettle international relations. Irrespective of its merits, the proposed definition was problematic because it was put forward in the context of a strategy that called for a permanent US military dominance of much of Eurasia that would allow the United States, rather than the UN Security Council, to act as the ultimate guarantor of international peace and security. The strategy envisioned achieving the goal by deterring potential competitors from even aspiring to a larger regional or global role, and by preempting the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Key elements of that strategy have guided US policy ever since, even if the draft in its final form was watered down after a leak sparked a public uproar because of its overarching imperial character. Those elements were reinforced in the wake of the 9/11 Al-Qaeda attacks, with its devastating consequences. As a senator at the time, Mr. Biden ridiculed the draft as literally a Pax Americana. It won't work, he said. You can be the world's superpower and still be unable to maintain peace throughout the world. Today, Mr. Biden is facing that reality with the fading hopes for a revival of the Iran nuclear agreement that potentially puts one more nail in the coffin of a regional security architecture that targets rather than includes the Islamic Republic. Even so, swan songs for US regional partnerships may be premature. Despite the daylight in attitudes towards the Ukraine crisis, a divergence in perceived national interests, Saudi and Emirati frustration with recent American policies, and uncertainty about Washington's continued commitment to regional security. Analysis of the impact and political significance of the US dependence between the United States and its regional partners that makes their partnerships both indispensable and irreplaceable for Middle Eastern autocratic rulers. In fact, close US-Saudi military cooperation continues despite the current strains in the relationship. The analysis also suggests that China and Russia have at best a limited capability to project force in the Middle East and lack the wherewithal to replace the United States as the guarantor of the region's autocratic rule. Moreover, the Russian military performance in Ukraine laid bare logistical and maintenance problems that, coupled with sanctions, make Russia a less attractive alternative arms supplier. In addition, Russia's losses diplomatically and politically may mean that it no longer will have a seat at the table. Also, the Saudi and Emirati crown princes may simply be testing the limits of the leverage they derive from their interdependence with the United States by refusing to increase oil production to reduce oil prices and acting with the United States against Russia. The potential demise of the Iran agreement, coupled with America redefining its commitment to Middle Eastern security, spotlights the need for a regional security forum that would facilitate confidence-building measures, including common approaches to transnational threats, such as climate change, food security, maritime security, migration, and public health. Mitigating in favor of a firmer grounding of the reduction of regional tension is the fact that it is driven not only by economic factors such as the economic transition in the Gulf and the economic crisis in Turkey, Iran, and Egypt, but also by big power geopolitics. The problem is that the sustainability of the dialing down of tensions in the Middle East between Israel, Gulf states, Egypt, Turkey, and Iran remains uncertain. The fragility of some of these relationships is evident in the slow progress in efforts to renew ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Turkey and Egypt, and differences and rivalries between various Middle Eastern players, including Turkey, Israel, and Iran, and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, as they play out in countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and Iraqi Kurdistan. The fragility is also evident in the lack of confidence complicating Russian-mediated efforts to achieve a rapprochement between Turkey and Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Moreover, the Russian attempt reverberates in the Gulf, where Qatar and Saudi Arabia oppose UAE endeavors to return Mr. al-Assad to the Arab fold 11 years after the Syrian membership in the Arab League was suspended because of the civil war. The UAE may be the most strategic in its effort to reshape the Middle East by shifting gears. It is, in the last 2 years, the UAE has moved away from hard power interventions to using its sovereign wealth funds to redesign regional relationship through economic diplomacy, with investments in countries such as Turkey, Israel, Syria, and Iraq. Meanwhile, China and Russia have spelled out that they would entertain the possibility of a greater engagement in regional security if Middle Eastern players take greater responsibility for managing regional conflicts, reducing tensions, and their own defense. Rhetoric aside, that is not different from what the United States, the provider of the Middle East security umbrella, is looking for in its attempts to rejigger its commitment in the Gulf. In addition to the emerging, albeit tentative macro-level big power consensus on a more inclusive multilateral approach, efforts by the major regional powers, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Turkey, Israel, and Iran, with the exception of any possibility of forging ties between the Jewish state and the Islamic Republic, to reduce tensions and put relations on a more even keel, contribute to an environment potentially conducive to a discussion of a more broad-based security architecture. The need to focus on conflict prevention and improved communication between regional rivals alongside more robust defense cooperation is evident, irrespective of whether the Iran nuclear accord is brought back from the dead, given that the covert war between Israel and Iran will continue no matter what happens. Israeli officials warned in September that an Israeli airstrike against Aleppo's airports was a warning to Syrian President al-Assad that his country's air transport infrastructure would be at risk if he continues to allow planes whose purpose is to encourage terrorism to land, a reference to flights operated on behalf of the Iranian military and Revolutionary Guards. Even so, the Biden administration remains focused on broadening responsibility for a regional security architecture that targets Iran rather than an inclusive structure that would give all parties a stake, seek to address root problems, and stymie an evolving arms race. The administration has encouraged security cooperation between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, two Arab states that 2 years ago established diplomatic relations with Israel, and Saudi Arabia, which has changed its long-standing hostile attitude towards the Jewish state, but refuses to formalize relations in the absence of a resolution of the Palestinian problem. This year's move of Israel from the US military's European to its Central Command, CENTCOM, that covers the Middle East facilitates coordination between regional militaries. In a first, Israel this year participated in a US-led naval exercise alongside Saudi Arabia, Oman, Comoros, Djibouti, Somalia, Yemen, and Pakistan, countries with which it has no diplomatic relations. Furthermore, CENTCOM plans to open a testing facility in Saudi Arabia to develop and assess integrated air and missile defense capabilities. The trend towards multilateralism will be driven as much by the strategic US focus on Asia, the effort to reduce European reliance on Russian energy in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine, and ultimately Chinese unwillingness to be dependent on a hostile US for its energy security. The understandings and agreements between all regional states, including those that do not have diplomatic relations, needed to introduce a multilateral security arrangement would be paradigm shifting and tectonic. The sea change would have to be based on three principles enunciated by Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar regarding his country's relations with China that are equally applicable in the Middle East: mutual sensitivity, mutual respect, and mutual interest. The understandings and agreements would have to involve credible abandonment of notions of regime change, recognition of the internationally recognized borders of all regional states, including Israel, non-aggression pacts, conflict management and conflict resolution mechanisms, arms control, a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a nuclear-free zone, to name the most difficult and seemingly utopian ones. The fact that the fate of Iran's nuclear program is the switch at a Middle Eastern crossroads underscores the need to tackle sensitive issues head-on, rather than kick the can down the road for opportunistic domestic political reasons. It also highlights the need for a concerted regional and international effort and confidence-building measures inspired by the concessions they would entail. That in turn would require the political will to revisit issues without the debilitating lens of ideology, preconception, and prejudice. Iran's nuclear program is a case in point. In the 1980s, Iran's leaders revived the country's nuclear program as a result of the Iran-Iraq War. The program was originally initiated in the 1960s by the Shah and initially put on hold in the wake of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. However, the war persuaded Iran's leader that the program could be a deterrent against perceived US efforts to change the regime in Tehran. The conviction that the United States and the Gulf were seeking to topple the Islamic regime was cemented by their support for Iraq's 8-year-long war, in which Saddam Hussein, a no less brutal leader than Iran's revolutionaries, deployed chemical weapons. The Gulf War also sparked the Islamic Republic's ballistic missile program and its interest in developing a chemical weapons capability. Iranian leaders' willingness to work with Israelis suggested that they were not picky in choosing whom to cooperate with in achieving their goals. To be sure, the knife cuts both ways. Iran's declared ambition to export the revolution, coupled with the 444-day occupation in 1979 and 1980 of the US Embassy in Tehran, was destined to provoke a response. Yet, when Iranian leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini in 1988 swallowed the poison of agreeing to a ceasefire with Iraq in a war that Iran had not started, nationalism had largely replaced revolutionary zeal. The subsequent emergence of pro-Iranian militias in various Arab countries was part of a defense and security strategy designed to take the fight to Iran's detractors, and an effort to ensure Iranian regional influence rather than export the revolution per se. There is no guarantee that less US, European, and Gulf support for Iraq's war effort and a more even-handed approach to the conflict would have set the Islamic Republic and the Middle East on a different course. But by the same token, there is no guarantee that the region would be worse off had the international community attempted to do so. Whatever the case, the reality is that Iran today is at the very least close to becoming a nuclear threshold state, and will be one with or without a revival of the nuclear accord. That does not mean that the agreement has become irrelevant. On the contrary, its fate, no matter how flawed or problematic the agreement may be, will shape regional security in the foreseeable future. It will determine the environment in which confidence can or cannot be built, and understandings can be achieved on sensitive issues, without which any attempted multilateral security architecture will either be impossible to construct or, if created, likely to collapse if it is not stillborn from the outset. A realistic assessment of what is possible could help the United States kickstart a process to create a more sustainable basis for dialing down of regional tensions. One such assessment would be a realistic evaluation of military options to halt Iran's nuclear program. Respected Israeli national security journalist Yossi Melman argues that Israel lacks the military capabilities to destroy Iran's decentralized program, despite claims to the contrary, partly because the United States has yet to bolster Israeli capabilities by supplying it with bunker-busting bombs. The United States is the only country with a military option against Iran, but has eschewed that route, Mr. Melman noted. Similarly, Iran and its detractors risk being blinded by their perception of the other, which becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy reinforced by mutual demonization. Mr. Melman further points out that countries like Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, determined to develop nuclear weapons, did so within 5 to 7 years. Iran's revived its nuclear program more than 3 decades ago. How can we explain that 35 years after it launched its efforts, Iran still doesn't have a bomb and hasn't even passed the nuclear threshold? Mr. Melman asked. Let me leave it here, and hopefully this gives food for thought in the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I don't know where to start. Thank you for giving us so much food for thought, and of course also for questions. I mean, I have to say, I should tell you that I wrote my dissertation about the Iraqi nuclear program. So I was a lot dealing with the 80s also. And I always have been believing that the JCPOA would be a good solution addressing an acute problem of nuclear proliferation. But it's very hard to imagine that under the circumstances we see now in Iran, the turmoil, and for example, also Europe today slapping Iran with new sanctions, and that those negotiations could go on, and perhaps, I mean, I don't know. Perhaps it's a different talk. Iran we are talking about than 1 month ago. I'm not sure. But what I really want to would I ask you to go a little bit more into it, because also the case I started with, because you mentioned, I mean, the United States decision, which should come in mid-November, I think 17th of November, to accept this immunity, immunity of Mohammed bin Salman in the Khashoggi case. And what I find is interesting, that Saudi Arabia also, I mean, denies any link with their OPEC decision, and also the link of making now policies supporting the Russia. And we saw, as you also mentioned, these 400 millions which the Saudis donated to Ukraine, and the UN General Assembly, where Saudi Arabia and also United Arab Emirates voted for the resolution, which is not costly. It doesn't cost anything. They don't have it doesn't have any consequences. So could you, I mean, explain us the connection a little bit better? Do you think, I mean, this Saudi OPEC decision, how do you see it, or has it only to do it with internal economic needs of a high oil price, or what is it politically?
There's no doubt in my mind that this was a political decision.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the Saudis did have fairly legitimate concerns with regard to the oil price. They need about $80 to $85 a barrel to be able to balance their budget. And you did see in recent months a significant decrease in the oil price. And that's something of concern, particularly given the kind of projects that Mohammed bin Salman wants to fund. Having said that, I think that was one consideration. What I think was a much more important consideration was that you've got a tug of war, if you wish, between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser degree the UAE. And it's a question of trying to see who comes out of this face-off, if you wish, stronger, and therefore has somewhat greater leverage in the relationship. You're also already seeing that the Saudis particularly are taken aback by the degree of anger that the OPEC decision has sparked.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they shouldn't be really surprised, given that almost anything that Mohammed bin Salman has done since Joe Biden went on a pilgrimage to Jeddah in July has been to poke an eye in Biden's poke Biden's eye, particularly with regard to human rights abuses.
You mean now the sentence against these, for example, women activists of 35 years or something?
The two women who were tweeting, who were sent to respectively 34 and 45 years in prison. The sentencing of 3 tribesmen who had been evicted from land that is being used or was confiscated to build Neom, this sort of science fiction city on the Red Sea. And now the naming as president of the counterterrorism court of a detective who allegedly was involved in the cover-up of the Khashoggi killing. Mm-hmm. I mean, those are all pokes in the eye that came in advance, if you wish, of the OPEC decision. So the Saudis have really been taken aback, and I think what you're seeing is a degree of backtracking. Mm-hmm. You're seeing that in part with the humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but also the UAE putting privately out that they were actually against this decision, but then again they went along with the majority and
I
so
didn't
on.
know that. So the
Well,
UA said that they were not.
they're saying that privately. They're not
I
saying
didn't know.
that
Okay.
publicly.
Mm,
So you're seeing a degree of backtracking on that. I tend to believe, but that's, if you wish, a degree of speculation, that there's another motive, and that motive is the midterm elections in the United States. Uh, there is no question that there is no love lost between Mohammed bin Salman and Joe Biden, and that the days of, certainly to Mohammed bin Salman, the days of Donald Trump are days that they relish, and certainly would not be opposed to seeing a return to.
mm,
So it could very well be, and it would not be the first time that Saudi policies have been geared to try and influence U.S. Politics. It could very well be that this was very deliberate.
mm-hmm. Very interesting. And I mean, do you expect? No, I think this is very hard to speculate, but the issue about the immunity, which has to be decided mid-November. I mean, the U.S. government, as far as I understand, the Justice Ministry could have said also simply, it's not. I mean, we are not. We don't have to decide this. It's up to the court, isn't it? Is this correct?
Uh, no, not really. So, well, the answer is yes and no. As a matter of principle, what international law says is you are a head of state, a head of government, or foreign minister. If you have one of those positions, then you have sovereign immunity. Period. It's the prerogative of the government in the United States in this case whether or not to recognize sovereign immunity
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
uh, of another official. And it's sort of standard practice that the judiciary in the United States seeks the advice of the administration.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes perfect sense to me that the administration would not want to leave this in the hands of a judge.
Mm.
There's too much consequence involved in this. And there's too little fig leaf, if you wish, for the administration to say that if the court were not to convey or not to recognize sovereign immunity, oh well, we couldn't do much about it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody would buy the argument.
Mm-hmm.
So, Biden's basically in a catch-22.
Yeah.
Whatever he does is going to spark significant criticism.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if he does not convey sovereign immunity or does not advise the court that the administration would favor sovereign immunity, and U.S. courts in those cases tend to abide by the advice of the administration, then I think you're going to see a rupture in relations between Saudi Arabia and the United States.
Mm.
If
so, yeah, sorry.
If the administration decides that it will recognize sovereign immunity, then obviously, what are the serious consequences that Biden has promised in response to the OPEC Plus decision? Now, one way out of this crisis, it doesn't resolve it, but it buys the administration time, is to go back to the court and basically say the same thing that they have publicly said about a response to the OPEC Plus decision, which is we're gonna respond after the midterm elections.
Mm.
So, with other words, kick the ball further down the road, and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, but so it's true for both, for the Middle East states and also for the Biden administration, that the Ukraine war changed a lot. I mean, they had to adjust their policies accordingly. One further question, because you mentioned the different I mean, really bad policies and bad decisions throughout the way of U.S. Middle East policy, starting with Iraq and uh, but isn't it a kind of also not contradiction, but saying that the US troops presence is autocratizing, has an autocratizing effect and supports autocracy of the host regime. Okay, in the case of Afghanistan, they just leave. But also, this is highly problematic. I mean, isn't it this one also irresolvable US problem? If they stay, it's bad. If they leave, it's bad. So, how do you see Afghanistan and the reaction, and what was thought about it in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi and the reflection on their policies?
Well, I think let me phrase it this way. I think that there's a major distinction between the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's too easy to
Yeah.
sort of lump them together as wars of choice.
Yes, of course.
I was opposed, if I think back of those days, I was at the time opposed to a US military intervention in Afghanistan. And I thought you need to talk first before you intervene, and you need to consult with your allies. And 3 weeks into the intervention, I changed my mind. And what sparked the change was that it was the first time that I realized that the United States and the Taliban had been talking for 3 years. They'd been meeting in Geneva, in New York, in Islamabad, in various other places. And they were discussing the question of an extradition of Osama bin Laden.
Yes.
And the Taliban were refusing. And so in my mind, when 9/11 happened, if you've been talking for 3 years, there was nothing more to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps
That's
we should
very
mention
different.
for the audience that there were the Al-Qaeda attacks against the embassies
The 9/11 attacks.
no,
Indeed,
before
on
in Africa, the
right.
Tanzania.
There was the USS Cole, and there was the in 1998 the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam.
Dar es Salaam, yeah.
So at that point, Iraq was a very different case. The problem with the Iraq-Afghanistan war is it's a problem that the United States fundamentally has. And that is, you can win on a battlefield, but unless you rebuild that country and rebuild it in an inclusive way, you may have lost the war for all practical effect of it. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. War, I think you've got to define war not only as what happens on the battlefield with set pieces, artillery, tanks, air force, what have you, but also what happens in the aftermath of that war. And the United States has never been good at that.
No. Yeah, absolutely. And what also I would add, and I want to hear your opinion about it, this list of reasons, I mean, which are also, disappointments, or disappointments, but in a way they are disgruntled by certain US decisions. Was not one very decisive moment also when Obama let Hosni Mubarak down in Egypt in already in January, I would say, 2011, and everybody understood that if the United States allow such a really backbone, such an important element of US security in the region fall, that it could really happen to anyone if it happens to to Mubarak, that the American president says, so and so has to leave.
That certainly was the way it was perceived in capitals like Riyadh and like Abu Dhabi. But I think you need to go back 10 years. So US policy was always by definition a contradiction. It was a call for democracy, for adherence by human rights, for transparency, for governance, accountability, and at the same time, it was support of the status quo. One of the things, we look back today post-Trump at George W. Bush and think, God, we would have been a lot better off had we had him instead of Donald Trump. But in the days of George Bush, certainly liberals looked at George Bush with absolute horror. And lost in that memory is the fact that it was George Bush and Susan Rice, first National Security Council and then Secretary of State, who basically said, and I'm paraphrasing this, we, the United States, were co-responsible for 9/11. We supported these regimes.
I think Condoleezza Rice it was, not Susan.
Bush said it too.
Okay.
Both of them said it. And that's where the ill-fated democracy program of the Bush administration came out of. So it's not that surprising that if there was a genuine indigenous movement that overthrew the autocrat, the United States was not going to step in and suppress it. Because, what the statement means of the United States did not protect Mubarak would have meant U.S. intervention or U.S. support for a military coup, as we saw in 2013 in Egypt, with all its consequences. So yes, Gulf states, other autocrats in the Middle East were very concerned about this turnaround. But it goes back also to the perception, and that's part of the contradiction of the U.S. policy, that U.S. policy or the U.S. security commitment is a commitment to maintain the regime. It's not necessarily that. It's a commitment against external forces. It's a commitment to maintain security of waterways. It's not a commitment to ring fence the palace in Riyadh, even if there was all kinds of discussion at various points over the years of what would happen if the regime in Saudi Arabia fell, and then we'll then get an Islamist nationalist military, which would be even worse. So I think it's a much more complex discussion, and the allegation that this demonstrated unreliability of the United States is a bit of a simplification of the issue.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't have to tell you, but all the conspiracy theories which resulted out of this support, by the way, also the European cooperation with the then elected the Muslim Brotherhood dominated parliament and president and so on. Where the conspiracy theory went, of course, that we, the West, wanted kind of Muslim Brotherhood governments in power in the
Which
Middle
I
East.
think is false. I mean, I think, it's interesting. Shadi Hamid, a scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington, just published this week a book on democracy. And in that book, one of the things that he argues is, if you're going to adhere to a democratic process, you're going to have to accept that people may vote something into government that you find dangerous.
Well,
and whatever your attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood is, this was the only fair and democratic election in Egyptian history.
Well, of course, the developments after these elections were also quite frightening. I mean, it's a huge dilemma. No?
Sure. Although I think it's a very politicized discussion.
Yeah. Yeah.
In which everybody has their demons.
Mm.
There's no question that Mohamed Morsi was the wrong person at the wrong time. And if someone had given him a checklist of what not to do, he would have checked every box on the piece of paper.
Mm.
But the fact of the matter also is that he had a judiciary and a military that from day one was determined to get him out of office.
Mm.
And so some of these things that are held against him and are seen as evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood was never, at least in Egypt, never serious about a democratic process, were responses to that, not very smart responses, wrong responses, but they were responses to that.
Well, time is running, but if you allow me, I want to give you this question, which comes
Please.
From our audience. The question is, I read it simply. Is not there an inherent contradiction in international law between non-interference in country sovereignty and pushing Western concepts of human rights on them, if necessary, by the use of force? This is the question.
Absolutely. I mean, look, there are lots of contradictions in international law. So, on what grounds do you give a different status to a political leader, or to a state for that matter, from what you would give to a commoner? So the argument, I feel threatened by what my neighbor is doing, so I will invade Yemen or I will invade Ukraine. Well, if you're my neighbor and I feel threatened by you and I burn your house down, I'd be in jail almost immediately. And the question is, why don't you apply the same principle? That's one. Two, you mentioned Qatar at the very beginning of this conversation, and one of the debates in around the Qatar World Cup is the issue of LGBT rights. And there you have a situation where, in my mind, the Qataris are trying to find a middle road here, in which it's a live and let live situation, in which they have to balance a very conservative populace with demands for rights during the World Cup by the international community. But the fact of the matter is, and that's maybe the difference between, for example, the labor issue and the LGBT issue. On the labor issue, you probably would have found a fair amount of Qataris who were in favor of change. I'm sure that if you legislated LGBT rights in Qatar, or in most Muslim countries, few exceptions, the population would not abide by the law, because that rejection is so deeply ingrained. So, with other words, if you want to get to A to B, hitting somebody over the head continuously isn't good to get them to move. It's going to be a process. And it's going to be engagement. And so, yes, absolutely. The contradiction that your member of the audience posed, absolutely, it's there, and it's going to backfire.
Well, we promised to say goodbye after 1 hour, because it's really late where you are. And
no, that's fine.
I thank you so much. I mean, of course, we could continue for a very long time talking about China, talking about the Abraham Accords. I mean, you mentioned them, talking also about Turkey and its relationship. I mean, for example, making a total change of policy also regarding our Khashoggi case, which we mentioned. I mean, Turkey was the driving force. Turkey started all of this, no? And now we see Mohammed bin Salman going to Ankara and vice versa, no? Also Erdogan. So I only can hope that you will come back and
It
perhaps,
would be my pleasure.
yes, and perhaps at the time where we don't have such a bad feeling and keeping you longer. And
No, no,
thank you.
please don't feel bad. On the
And
contrary,
thank you
I
very
enjoyed
much.
it.
I see. May I only look what it is? Uh, okay, if you allow,
Please.
what if we find that the Iranian regime on the CPOA turns out as trustworthy as Putin on Ukraine? Yes, I mean, uh, yeah.
Well, I think that first of all, I think that that Putin was very trustworthy on Ukraine. He was very clear about it. He was very clear that Ukraine is not a state and doesn't exist. It's part of Russia.
Yeah, he said it several times also
And he was
before.
also very clear in what this goes to a longer discussion, but what I would call the rise of civilizationalist leaders. With other words, leaders that no longer think in national terms, they think in civilizational terms. And they define the borders of their countries in civilizational rather than national terms. And Putin's been very clear about that. In the case of Iran, the track record is very different. There is no disagreement that Iran abided by the nuclear agreement. Even the opponents of the agreement would admit that until Trump withdrew in 2018, the Iranians abided. And in fact, they abided a year longer, and only in 2019 started to violate the agreement as a point of leverage. Was the agreement flawed? There's no question about it. Was the agreement limited and didn't address concerns that were major concerns to others in the Middle East, including the ballistic missile program and Iran's external relationships with non-state actors? Sure. But the track record that Iran had from 2015 to 2018 is undisputed. As undisputed as Putin's track record was, that he was clear of what he thought about Ukraine.
Well, yeah, as I always say, the JCPOA was meant to address one issue, and that's it. No, yeah.
If I can add one last thing.
Yes, of course.
Which is, the issue of the ballistic missiles and of the non-state actors are legitimate issues. The way they were, one reason why this whole thing failed, not the only reason, the Iranians were part of this, but why the renegotiation of the agreement failed was that the approach was, we have to limit the ballistic missile program and we have to disrupt the relationship with the non-state actors. Fact of the matter is that both of those, the Iranians have barely have an air force. They don't have much of a navy beyond little fast boats. Ballistic missiles and non-state actors are the core of their defense. So if you want to address those issues, you're going to have to address the underlying security issues that the Iranians are concerned about. And that is what never has, what never has been done.
But as far as I understand, in the last draft, which the Iranians rejected, I mean, this was not addressed. This is why so many criticized it. But I think it's spilled milk by now. We'll see. I mean, I was surprised today to notice that the discussion, if there are if it's still possible or not, is still going on. I would not expect that, to be honest, but we will see.
Yeah, although it would be hard for the administration in the current environment of what is happening in Iran.
Exactly. Also for the Europeans, also for the
or for the Europeans to sign an agreement. Even if they reach the agreement today, I think that ultimately announcing it would need to take time.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest. I mean, also the Iranian regime is So and its paranoia perhaps also increased, and they are also less willing
Absolutely.
to compromise. No?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much, James. Thank you
Thank you for
for
having me.
talking to us, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.
It would be
Bye
my
bye
pleasure. Thank
to
you.
the east. Bye bye.
Bye bye and all the best.
Thank you.
Bye bye.